The knock came just as Caleb was about to take his first bite of dinner. It was one of those cold winter nights when the air outside felt sharp and the apartment seemed smaller than usual. He'd been living alone for years now, ever since the divorce, and his life had settled into a quiet rhythm he rarely broke. Work, dinner, maybe a show, then bed. When he opened the door, she was standing there. Emily. He'd seen her in the hallway before, always in a hurry, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, polite but never stopping long enough for a real conversation. Tonight, she looked different. Her hair was damp from the misty air, a towel tucked under one arm, a small bottle of shampoo in her hand like it was her ticket inside. "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you," she said, a little out of breath. "I live right next door. My shower just broke, and I need to get ready for work tonight. Would it be too much trouble to use yours?" Caleb hesitated, not because he wanted to say no, but because it had been a long time since anyone had asked him for help. Still, there was something in her expression, a mix of exhaustion and hope, that made the decision for him. "Sure," he said, stepping aside. "Come on in." Her smile was small but real. "Thank you, I'll be quick." As the bathroom door closed behind her and the sound of running water filled the apartment, Caleb sat back down at his table. The lasagna was still warm, but his appetite had shifted. Something about this unexpected interruption lingered in his mind, a reminder that even the smallest knock can change the shape of a quiet evening. When Emily came out of the bathroom, a wave of steam followed her into the hallway, carrying the clean scent of soap. Her cheeks were warm from the hot water, her hair damp, and she clutched the towel close as if to guard the little comfort she'd just borrowed. "You really saved me," she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of weariness that went deeper than just a bad day. "It's already been one of those days. And then the shower." She let the sentence trail off with a tired shrug. "Anyway, thank you." Caleb managed a small smile. "No problem." She slipped out the door and the apartment returned to its usual stillness. But Caleb found himself just sitting there, staring at his half-eaten dinner. He kept seeing that look in her eyes, the heaviness, the way she seemed to be holding herself together by sheer will. The next morning, they crossed paths in the hallway. Emily was in a simple coat, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, but the dark circles under her eyes were harder to miss in the daylight. "Rough night?" Caleb asked, the words out before he could think about them. She gave a small, humorless laugh. "More like a rough week. My mum's sick, bills are piling up, and my boss has made it pretty clear I'm on thin ice. Now the plumbing's shot, and I can't afford to fix it yet, but I'll figure it out." For a moment, they just stood there in the drafty hallway. Caleb wanted to offer something more than sympathy, but all he said was, "That's a lot, I'm sorry." She gave a faint smile, as if appreciating that he didn't try to wrap it in false comfort, then headed for the stairs. Caleb watched her go, the sound of her footsteps fading. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself wishing he could do something to make her stay. That night, long after Caleb had turned off the lights, he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Through the thin wall he could hear it, faint at first, then clearer. Emily was crying. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just the quiet, broken kind of sound someone makes when they're trying not to be heard. He thought about knocking on her door, asking if she was okay, but they'd barely spoken before yesterday. What if she felt embarrassed? Still, the sound stayed with him, tugging at something he'd tried to keep locked away. He remembered the look in her eyes in the hallway that morning, the way she'd forced a smile like it might keep her from unraveling. The next day, during his lunch break, Caleb made a decision. He called a local plumber, explained that his neighbour's shower was broken, and asked if they could fix it that afternoon. He didn't go into details about her life, it wasn't his to share, but he made sure the bill was sent to him. It wasn't cheap, but he didn't care. By the time he got home from work, the job was done. Caleb waited outside her apartment door, the receipt in his hand, wondering if she'd be upset or grateful. When Emily came down the hallway carrying a bag of groceries, she stopped short at the sight of him. "I had someone come by today," he said, holding out the paper. "Your shower's fixed." Her eyes widened. "You did that? Why?" He gave a small shrug. "Because sometimes people deserve a break." For a second she just stood there, searching his face. Then she set her groceries down, stepped forward, and wrapped her arms around him. Caleb couldn't remember the last time someone had hugged him like that. With sincerity, without hesitation. And in that moment, he realized helping her wasn't just for her sake, it was for his too. After that night, something shifted between them. Emily started stopping by more often, sometimes with a plate of cookies she'd baked, sometimes with leftover takeout she didn't want to waste. Other times she'd just knock and ask if she could sit for a while. At first, their conversations were light. They talked about the strange creaks and groans of the old apartment building, about the best diner within walking distance, about the weather that couldn't make up its mind. But slowly, little pieces of her life began to slip through. She told Caleb about her mum's treatments, how the insurance barely covered anything, and how every paycheck seemed to vanish before she even saw it. Some evenings, she would curl up on his couch with a blanket while he flipped through channels until they landed on an old black and white movie. They'd watch in comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Other nights, she'd open up more, about the pressure at work, about feeling like she was always one mistake away from losing everything. Caleb never tried to fix her problems, he just listened. And maybe that was what she needed most. Someone who wasn't judging her, rushing her, or waiting for their turn to talk. One night after she left, Caleb found himself smiling for no reason. For years, his life had been nothing but routines. But now there was something else, a corner of warmth in his days, a reason to look forward to coming home. He didn't know it yet, but this friendship was going to change far more than just his evenings. It was a Saturday morning when Emily knocked again. Caleb figured it might be for coffee, the way she sometimes did, but when he opened the door, she was holding a cardboard box. "Thought you might like these," she said with a grin, stepping inside. Inside the box were old board games, mismatched mugs with chipped handles, and a worn case holding her favourite childhood movie, the one she'd watched so many times she could quote every line. "Mom's been making me clean out her attic. I figured you could help me put them to use." They ended up on the living room floor, sorting through the box piece by piece. Emily told him where each thing came from. The mug her dad used for cocoa on Christmas Eve, the board game she always lost to her brother, the movie that still made her laugh even when life didn't. She laughed a lot that morning, the kind of laugh that makes you forget, for a little while, how heavy life can be. Somewhere between the bad coffee and a game of cards, Caleb realised he wasn't just letting her into his apartment anymore. He was letting her into the space he'd kept locked up for years. After the divorce, he'd built a life so quiet it almost felt safe. Safe from disappointment, safe from loss, but also safe from anything good finding its way in. Letting her in meant risking all of that. But watching her sit cross-legged on his rug, smiling at some old memory, he began to think the risk might be worth it. When she left that afternoon, she paused at the door. "Thanks for letting me take over your Saturday," she said. Caleb shook his head. "You didn't take it over, you made it better." She gave him a long, thoughtful look, then smiled softly before heading down the hall. And Caleb knew, without needing to say it, that he wanted her in his life for as long as she'd stay. A few weeks later, Caleb noticed a change in Emily. She still stopped by now and then, still brought cookies or leftovers, but the easy light in her eyes had dimmed. One evening she sat on the edge of his couch, turning a mug of tea in her hands without drinking it. "Long day?" Caleb asked gently. She gave a short laugh, but it lacked warmth. "More like a long week. My boss told me if I'm late one more time, I'm done. And with Mum's bills, I can't afford to lose this job. I feel like I'm running on fumes, and no matter how fast I move, I'm still falling behind." Caleb leaned back, choosing his words carefully. "You're handling more than most people could. That's not nothing." For a moment she looked like she might cry, but she blinked it away and changed the subject. They ended up watching a movie, though Caleb doubted either of them paid much attention to the screen. After she left, he sat alone in the quiet, thinking about how quickly life could wear someone down. He knew the feeling. The way you can hold everything together for so long until one more thing threatens to tip the balance. He didn't know exactly what he could do to help her, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let her face it all alone. The next morning, Caleb woke earlier than usual. The apartment was quiet, but his mind wasn't. He kept seeing the way Emily had looked the night before, tired in a way that no amount of sleep could fix. He made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and thought about what he could do. It didn't need to be big or complicated, just something to remind her she wasn't carrying everything alone. By mid-morning, he had a plan. He stopped by the corner bakery and bought 2 cranberry muffins, the kind she once told him reminded her of visiting her grandmother. He picked up her usual coffee order too, oat milk with 1 pump of vanilla. When he knocked on her door, Emily appeared with her hair still tousled from sleep, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Caleb, what's all this?" "What's all?" "Breakfast delivery," he said, holding up the bag. "Figured you could use a slow start for once." At first, she insisted she had too much to do, but then she sat at her small kitchen table, took a bite of the muffin, and closed her eyes for just a second. When she opened them again, there was a softness there he hadn't seen in weeks. They talked for over an hour, not about bills or work, but about her favourite hiking trail, the dog she'd had as a kid, the silly songs her mum used to sing while cooking. Caleb listened, smiling, realising how rare it was to see her this relaxed. When he finally stood to leave, she followed him to the door. "Thank you for not just looking the other way," she said quietly. Caleb didn't tell her, but in that moment he understood. She wasn't the only one being helped here. Spring was slow to arrive that year. The mornings still carried a chill, but the afternoons had a hint of warmth that made people linger outside a little longer. Emily had been smiling more lately, and Caleb liked to think it wasn't just because of the change in weather. One Saturday, while Caleb was tightening a loose hinge on a cabinet, there was a knock on his door. Emily stood there with a small bundle of flowers wrapped in brown paper. "Farmer's market," she said, holding them out. "Thought your place could use a little colour." Caleb found an old mason jar, filled it with water, and set the flowers on the counter. Then, almost without thinking, they decided to walk to the park a few blocks away. They stopped for ice cream from a food truck and found a bench in the sun, watching kids race each other across the grass. It wasn't a special occasion, but it felt like one. At one point, Emily looked down at the half-melted ice cream in her hand and said quietly, "You know, the night my shower broke, I almost didn't knock. I thought you'd think it was weird, or that you'd say no, but something told me to try." She glanced at him with a small smile. "I'm glad I did." Caleb wanted to tell her how glad he was too, how that knock had been the first real change in a life that had gotten far too quiet, how it had brought mornings with muffins, evenings with laughter, and days like this. But all he said was, "Me too." On the walk home, Emily looped her arm through his like it was the most natural thing in the world, and in that small gesture, Caleb felt the quiet truth settle in. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped being just a neighbour. It was late one evening when Caleb heard another knock. When he opened the door, Emily stood there with an envelope in her hands, gripping it like it might slip away if she loosened her hold. Her cheeks were flushed, eyes bright in a way he hadn't seen for months. "I wanted you to be the first to know," she said, stepping inside before he could ask. She handed him the envelope. Inside was a letter printed on crisp company stationery, an official promotion, a real one. Higher pay, better benefits, and, most importantly, the security she'd been desperate for. "I can finally cover Mum's treatments without wondering if I can keep the lights on," she said, her voice trembling between relief and disbelief. "I've been working toward this for years, and honestly, Caleb, I don't think I would have made it without you." He shook his head. "Emily, you did this, you worked for it, you earned it." She smiled, but her eyes shimmered. "Maybe, but you reminded me I wasn't alone. You made me believe again." They sat down on the couch, the same spot where she'd once cried months ago, back when her world felt like it was falling apart. Caleb thought about that night, about how close he'd come to letting her walk away without helping, and how different both their lives might have been if he had. Sometimes change doesn't start with a grand gesture. Sometimes it starts with a small knock on a door, and someone choosing to open it. That night, after Emily left with the letter tucked safely in her bag, Caleb stayed on the couch a while longer. The apartment was quiet, but it didn't feel empty the way it used to. The flowers she'd brought weeks ago had long since faded, Yet he hadn't thrown them out. They sat in the same mason jar on the counter, a reminder of how something small could change so much. He thought about the man he'd been before that knock, the one who kept his head down, convinced himself he was fine inside his carefully built bubble. And then he thought about the life he had now. Saturday mornings with muffins, evenings filled with old movies, afternoons in the park, and a neighbour who had become so much more than that. It struck him that maybe fixing her shower hadn't been about plumbing at all. Maybe it had been about opening a door he'd kept closed for too long, not just to her but to connection, to warmth, to the risk of caring again. We all have moments where it feels easier to stay behind our own locked doors, to tell ourselves we're too busy, too tired, or too cautious to get involved. But Caleb knew better now. Sometimes when you hear a knock, it's not just someone asking for help. It's life giving you a chance to be part of something bigger than yourself. And from that night on, he decided he'd always answer. Because he knew, without a doubt, you never really know what might be waiting on the other side. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can open the biggest doors, not just for someone else, but for yourself. Thank you for staying with me until the very last moment of this story. I'm truly grateful for your time and support. If you enjoyed it, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you again soon here on Rain Inside.